Thank you so much for that generous introduction, and thank you to Latham and Watkins for hosting us today. As Amy mentioned, I am the Executive Director of the Constitutional Sources Project here in Washington, D.C. I've also been a member of the Ms. JD family for over 6 years in a variety of different capacities, including on their board of directors. I'm also a total Notorious RBG fangirl. I have the jabots, T-shirts, bobbleheads, and even a Halloween costume to prove it, which I briefly contemplated wearing today, but couldn't get access to my office this morning to get the jabot ahead of time, and really the costume loses a little bit. Without it, I thought it was appropriate because in addition to discussing Justice Ginsburg's life and legacy, we're also discussing her recent rise as an international cultural icon, which is completely unique for a United States Supreme Court justice, and awesome, I might add. I'm absolutely thrilled to kick off this afternoon's book event about the Notorious RBG, the life and times of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. If you do not have this beautiful book already, go and order it. Irin Carmon and Shauna Kniznik. I practiced that, and you guys have such hard to pronounce names. That's okay. But you're really good about phonetically spelling them on your social media accounts. The week of its release, it debuted at number 7 on the New York Times bestseller list. I'm told that it's still on the New York Times bestseller list for nonfiction, which is really exciting. I will go ahead and turn it over to our moderator, Juliana Siconolfi, who is a member of Ms. JD's board of directors. She chairs Ms. JD's academic committee and is a member of its marketing and communications committee. Juliana is a professorial lecturer in law at the George Washington University Law School. Her research interests include the intersections between forms of expression and equality, diversity in the fashion and beauty industries, professionalism, positive psychology, and legal education pedagogy. With that, Juliana, I will leave it to you.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? All right, excellent. Well, on behalf of Ms. JD, I want to welcome everyone and thank you very much for being here. I also want to thank Julie Silverbrook very much, as well as Amy Rigdon for their introductions. And of course, thank Latham and Watkins as well for this wonderful space and lovely event that they have put on for us today. So it is my pleasure to introduce today's guest, Irin Carmon. Irin is a national reporter at MSNBC, where she covers gender, politics, and law. She is also a visiting fellow at Yale Law School's program for the Study of Reproductive Justice. Previously, she was a staff writer at Salon and Jezebel. Irin was named a Best TV Pundit of the Year by Mediaite and one of the 30 under 30 in media by Forbes. And her work on reproductive rights has been honored by Planned Parenthood, NARAL-NY, the Sidney Hillman Foundation, and the New York Abortion Access Fund. We are so happy to speak with her about her latest accomplishment, co-authoring this book that we referenced before, and I think you all are well aware of, and I imagine that many of you have read as well. So without further ado, let's talk. First, I want to thank you again and also say hello to Shauna, who unfortunately is unable to join us today, but we are thinking of you, and thank you also for co-authoring this book. So I think, Irin, to start things off, we have a short presentation that you've prepared to kind of introduce us for those of us who maybe are not quite as familiar, or even if we are, we just want to see some really exciting images, a little bit more about the book.
Thank you so much
Sure.
to Julie and to Juliana. Thanks to all of you guys for coming today. Shauna sends her regrets. She's clerking on the 3rd Circuit, and they're sitting this week, so unfortunately she was unable to get away. But I'm here repping Team Notorious RBG. I just wanted to give you guys some backstory on how this all happened, and plus any excuse to show some of our favorite images from the book. So it all started in the summer of 2013. As you guys certainly know, usually by just before 4th of July, the end of June, is when the most important opinions come down from the Supreme Court. And that week, Justice Ginsburg had broken a record. As you know, it's customary for the justice who has the majority opinion to summarize from the bench his or her opinion. What's less common is for a justice to read his or her dissent from the bench. That week, Justice Ginsburg had broken a record by reading her dissent from the bench 3 times in 1 week in 4 cases. 2 of those cases were Civil Rights Act cases, Title VII. One of them was the Fisher affirmative action case, which is now back at the court. And on the penultimate day of the term, Justice Ginsburg takes her seat at the bench, and she's wearing what we now know to be her dissent jabot. That's, I in fact personally fact-checked this with Justice Ginsburg. That's what you can see in this live court sketch by Art Lean, which we also reproduce in the book. Because on that day, Justice Ginsburg dissented in Shelby County versus Holder, the case essentially gutting the Voting Rights Act, stripping preclearance. And it was a stunning blow to access to the ballot box for people of color. And Justice Ginsburg dissented on the grounds of, as she wrote in her opinion, throwing away preclearance when it has worked and is continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you are not getting wet. Now, as you know, Supreme Court opinions are rarely so lucid. It just so happens that this was the first quote on the Notorious RBG Tumblr, the first post. My co-author, Shauna, was a second-year law student at New York University. She was outraged at what the court had done that week. She's deeply invested in issues of racial justice and feminism, and is, after her clerkship, is going to work as a public defender. And at that point, she felt like Justice Ginsburg's voice was like a beacon in what she felt to be the darkness. And a friend of hers posted on Facebook, "Wow, Justice Ginsburg sure can write #Notorious RBG." And she thought, I need to celebrate this woman. At that point, she'd taken con law. She knew a little bit about Justice Ginsburg's contributions to the understanding of equal protection and women's equality under the Constitution. But at that point, it started with this one quote from Shelby, and it became a T-shirt. That's the first Notorious RBG T-shirt, which you can still get. And, all of a sudden, there was this outpouring of admiration and enthusiasm for a justice who at that point was 80 years old, who, was being celebrated in the vein of, or in a tongue-in-cheek joke and contrast with, a 300-plus pound gangster rapper. Not usually someone who's juxtaposed with a Supreme Court justice, least of all a tiny Jewish grandmother. So, needless to say, it caught on. There was this iconic portrait of the notorious B.I.G., and the same week of the Shelby decision, You Can't Spell Truth Without Ruth, made by 2 young digital activists, was papered around the city of D.C., right here in your own streets. We include that in the book as well. And many, many different kinds of T-shirts. This is actually my little brother modeling our official T-shirt, our book design T-shirt. Nail art. There is now Ruth Bader Ginsburg nail art. 2 different kinds, at least. This is really impressive. This one is handmade art. This is called Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg Smiting Her Enemies, which is funny because, people who were familiar with her on the court know how much she believes in collegiality. She only really smites her enemies with the force of her reason, I believe. Needlepoint. Lots of different needlepoint embroidery. Work for the things you care about. And the Lego. Shauna and I actually got to meet this Lego when we did a reading in Boston. And it's tiny, like her, but also very powerful. And of course, Halloween costumes. This year we're about to announce the winners of our RBG Halloween costume. We had so many submissions that we had to break it up into different categories. Squad, which includes baby Scalia, dogs, animals. There's some really funny dogs, babies. This happened. You got Ginsburg. This is a Saturday Night Live recurring character showing up on Weekend Update. I don't know that a Supreme Court justice has ever been memorialized such on Saturday Night Live. And tattoos. Several tattoos. And these, I had an opportunity to interview Justice Ginsburg in February in my capacity as a reporter at MSNBC, and I held up an iPad of the tattoo on the left here. That this was her face. At that point, I remembered that she's a Jewish grandma. I had a Jewish grandma, so she actually pulled me aside separately and also said this in the interview, that she thinks that tattoos are going too far. She doesn't think anyone should get a tattoo of her face. No shame to the folks who've already done it, but I'm just putting it out there. That's the point. She's like, it's permanent. Why would you do that? So that's that. So why is this all happening? I mean, of course, those of you who work in the law know that, there's very little fun and humor often in the law. I'm not a lawyer, but I feel okay about saying that. But, we would argue, and something that we really thought a lot about as we turned this fun phenomenon into a substantive reported biography, one that has all of these fun images and more, but also goes deeper to tell the story of her life, is that it started because it was celebrating a woman being celebrated in a way that we'd never seen before for her strength at a time in which Justice Ginsburg was being pressured to retire, was being told it was no longer her turn. She was using her power for what for liberals was the ultimate good, standing up for marginalized people. And she was refusing to back down, either for the people who wanted her to step away or for the majority of the court. She was making her voice heard. And I think that there's a real hunger. And subsequently, as you'll learn if you choose to pick up the book, we learned just how much throughout her life she's been underestimated and how much she stood up to use her voice, but very much on her own terms, looking very much behaving very much like a superhero, but not really looking like how we imagine superheroes to look. So I'll leave it at that.
That's great. Thank you for that introduction. I will forever remember the image of Justice Ginsburg looking at the tattoos. I love it. So one of my favorite parts of the book is that you have this intersection with so many different art forms. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the process of putting all of that together, because I imagine while you all do such a seamless job making it look easy, I imagine it was a lot of work.
Well, it's interesting because the Tumblr is one thing. Of course, it's spontaneous and raw. It has a kind of high-low mashup, and we wanted that spirit to be in the book, but we didn't want people to feel like they picked up like a printed-out blog. We wanted it to feel like something beautiful that you would hold in your hand, something that was visually lush. We thought a lot about the paper. God knows, we drove the design department at HarperCollins crazy for months. But we really wanted to have this feeling that I was so pleased to see described in the New York Times as the Talmud having a baby with a scrapbook. That's why we have, in fact, here I'll show you some of we have some images of Justice Ginsburg that have, I believe, never been published before. Oh, not that one. That one's been published. This is her high school yearbook photo. She was the treasurer of the Go-Getters. And this is her as a young mother at Harvard Law School with her husband and daughter. We wanted, we're so used to seeing Supreme Court justices, file down the aisle of the State of the Union. We wanted to capture her as a human being, as a passionately political person, as a brilliant jurist. Those are all facets of her being a human being, but also, and as one of the only women at Harvard Law School, one of only 9, and one of 2 women at the on the law review. This is a picture from the law review, and we circled it so that you don't lose her in the sea of men. And somebody who, we wanted photos like this, personal photos of Justice Ginsburg with her husband, with whom she had a almost lifelong love affair. So we were just thinking about how do we balance that. Then we did a lot of documents, too. We have a letter from Gloria Steinem. You may have seen that Gloria Steinem and Justice Ginsburg sat down for an interview that was published this past weekend in the Times. We have a letter that Gloria wrote her on Ms. Magazine's stationery, and I interviewed Gloria for the book, too. After, in 1976, Justice Ginsburg, then litigant and ACLU co-founder, ACLU co-founder Ginsburg, invited Gloria Steinem to be on a panel with her where they defended the Equal Rights Amendment. And they'd gone to Pennsylvania together to be on this panel, and they were against two anti-feminist guys. And I just so wish that there was video of this event. But we have Gloria Steinem's handwritten note to her saying how much RBG inspires her. So every single image was chosen either because we thought it was an incredible tribute to her or because we thought it told a story about her in a completely different way than words can do.
I think it's very palpable in the book. So it's clear that you admire Justice Ginsburg a lot. And I'm wondering if there is one particular characteristic or anecdote that you admire most or that really represents your admiration of her in the most powerful way.
Well, one of the stories that we tell in the book that I think is really important and that I didn't really understand before I started writing the book, even though I had heard her tell it before, is that in Justice Ginsburg's first brief to the Supreme Court in Reed v. Reed in 1971, she had an opportunity for the first time, to be known, to have the glory before the Supreme Court. And on the front page of the brief are listed the litigation director of the ACLU, Mel Wolfe, and then two women, Dorothy Kenyon and Polly Murray. And Polly Murray in particular was a woman who had been erased from history. She was the co-founder of the National Organization for Women. She was a black feminist civil rights activist who tried really hard to bridge between the civil rights movement and black feminists with white feminists, an often very painful conversation. And she, in fact, had been the first to propose that if we didn't get the Equal Rights Amendment, that we should use the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause to try to strike down sex categorizations in the law. So even though Polly Murray and Dorothy Kenyon, who was another left-wing activist at the ACLU and a feminist, hadn't actually written a word of the Reed v. Reed brief, Justice Ginsburg listed them as co-authors because she said, we stand on their shoulders. And I think a lot of the tensions in feminism between generations, between different demographics and backgrounds and cultures, come from a lack of giving credit and a lack of sharing resources. And I just thought it was incredibly meaningful in 1971 for Justice Ginsburg, who actually got pushback from the men at the ACLU, like, what are you doing? No one does that. That's very weird. But she said they deserve credit. And I thought that was just an ultimate gesture of understanding and empathy and grace.
Mm-hmm. And that is something that is definitely a takeaway from the book and very palpable, is how collegial she is, and that's really important to her. Where do you think that stems from?
Well, here, I'm going to go to another photo just for fun. So I think it came from the fact that so often in her life she was left out or the only one and had to survive and experienced enormous hardship in her life. Her sister died of meningitis when she was little, and her parents never really recovered. Her parents were both, her mother's family and her father were both refugees from pogroms. When she was a teenager, her mother got cervical cancer, and she would do her homework by her mother's sickbed every night. And her mother was somebody who had never gotten a chance to use all of her talents and intelligence and felt it very keenly and poured all of her hopes into her daughter. So young Ruth would sit by her bed and try to make her happy by reading and by studying. And indeed, she made the honor circle. She was accepted to college. And the day before her high school graduation, where she was destined to speak, scheduled to speak, her mother died. So all of the challenges that she's experienced, she's come through with a lot of resilience and a lot of grace. a lot of reserve as well. I mean, she's certainly not an outgoing person. It's one of the jokes of the Notorious RBG is that she's a very soft-spoken, quiet, reserved person. But I think having survived things like that made her think a lot about, her mother's experience made her think a lot about wasted potential. Surviving something like that, surviving her husband having cancer when they were in law school and having to stay up all night doing her own work and helping her husband with his, while they also took care of their toddler daughter. She's had to take care of a lot of people in her life. And yet she's come out of it with such a fierce determination to use her talents to make the world better. And so I think she realized that you can go through the world you have to push a little, but you have to do it in a way that will make other people join you. Even when she was on the DC circuit, she made friends with people who, every single book event that I have done, somebody has stood up and said, how can she be friends with Scalia? But again, I think she's looking at a long game, and she also realizes that people are people even if you deeply disagree with them.
In terms of your own collaboration with Shauna, do you have any tips for people who are looking to just learn a little bit more about how to effectively collaborate? I think it's something that's really important in the legal profession, and I think it's always great to gather more tips on how to do that well.
Well, what was great about our partnership is that we brought really different skill sets to the table. Shauna's a lawyer. I'm a journalist. So we each had different roles. And thank God for Google Docs. And we had a shared Tumblr that was password protected, and we would upload interviews that we had done or documents that we had found and just give each other a heads up. So that was a really great source. I think because we were... Also, Shauna was in law school and then taking the bar she took the bar the week that we got the proofs on the book, which was actually completely insane because it was a lot of work. And in fact, she found out on the day that the book came out that she had passed. And Justice Ginsburg sent her a note.
Oh my gosh, that's lovely.
Her. I believe she found out because her trainer told her. Her trainer is like a good friend of ours now. So she's somebody who we never felt like we could complain about how much work we had because, we didn't have a husband with cancer and a 4-year-old in law school at the same time, and she can survive on 2 hours of sleep. And we were also inspired by the fact that she is so uncomplaining and so collaborative with others and gives credit to others and tries not to let her ego get in the way. So we tried to adopt that between the two of us.
Great. That's a lot of good advice there. Speaking of advice, what do you think that Justice Ginsburg might say, excuse me, in terms of advice to people who are entering the legal profession, and particularly perhaps women who are pursuing a legal career?
Well, I've seen her, I've read a lot of her speeches and seen her answer this question before, and she always talks about how, even with lawyers who are not fully in full-time public service, to think about how do you use your talents for the good of others. And you might think, there's not enough time or I'm too busy, but she invariably says, when I asked her in the interview for MSNBC, how would you like to be remembered? And she said, as somebody who did the best that she could to repair the tears in society. And she sees law as a tool for that.
One of the other takeaways, I think, from this book is the value of role models, clearly, and mentorship. And I think that there are a lot of people in the legal profession who want to seek out mentors. And I'm wondering if either you have advice on seeking out effective mentorship, or if through your research of Justice Ginsburg, anything came up that you think would be applicable to that kind of, that kind of interest in doing so.
Well, Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, here I'm going to flip to another photo just for fun. Here, this is a good one because this is Justice Ginsburg at work when she was already litigating for the Supreme Court. So Sandra Day O'Connor was a great friend and ally to her on the court, even though their votes often diverged on the most important cases. But I think Justice Ginsburg was very grateful not to be the first woman on the court, because so often in other contexts in her life, she felt like she had to stand in for all women, which I think would be familiar to anybody who's ever been the first or the only, that everything you say feels like reflects on your category at large. So the fact that there was already a woman who had blazed that trail for her, I think really helped her. And then there's a story when Justice Ginsburg was assigned her first case, and it was what I think Chief Justice Roberts called some of the cases that no one wants, the dogs. It was a total dog. And she went to Sandra Day O'Connor and was like, what do I do? And which is funny because there's not a lot of stories where she's like, what did I do? Because she always seems so sure of everything. O'Connor just said, just do it. And then move on to the next one. Do it fast. Very no-nonsense advice. But then, and in the end, Justice O'Connor did not vote with Justice Ginsburg. She was in the minority. And when Justice Ginsburg delivered the opinion, Justice O'Connor passed her a note that said, this is your first opinion of the court. It is a fine one. I look forward to many more. And Justice Ginsburg felt so welcomed that she did the same thing when Justice Kagan and Justice Sotomayor joined the court, because she felt, it's kind of, I wouldn't call it exactly a hostile work environment, but to be the second, third, and fourth women, first, second, third, and fourth women on this court after hundreds of years, it's a daunting task. And to feel like there's another woman there that has your back, I think is really significant. And I think it's really interesting that there have been conversations not just about mentorship, but about sort of lateral support systems of helping other people who are coming up with you or near you, and being a support system that way. I think there's a lot of strength in that, and I think the women on the Supreme Court have really exemplified that. And in particular, I think Justice Ginsburg has been a mentor to Justice Kagan, who she has long been friends with even before she joined the court, and Justice Kagan would recommend a lot of her clerks when she was Dean of Harvard Law School. I mean, Justice Kagan is younger than Justice Ginsburg's daughter. So there's a real intergenerational friendship happening there.
Great. On a perhaps lighter note, pun intended, I know that Justice Ginsburg is a big fan of opera, and it sounds like Placido Domingo is one of her favorite opera stars. Do you know what her favorite opera is?
Her favorite opera is Don Giovanni.
Oh.
I'm also an opera fan, so I make sure to know that.
Very nice. So in one of your interviews about this book, you connected Justice Ginsburg's work with intersectional feminism, and you referred to it a little bit earlier on, too. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Sure. Well, I think it's really significant that Justice Ginsburg became Notorious RBG in a week in which she was primarily objecting to the rollback of remedies to racial discrimination. She's somebody who's been a passionate defender of racial equality. And intersectionality, for folks who might not be familiar with that word, is the prism on feminism and other social justice movements that looks at how people's identities intersect, how people aren't just a woman or a man, but they may also be an immigrant, queer, black, working class, first generation. So in thinking about how do you reconcile all these different identities, I think the spirit of credit giving exemplified by the Pauli Murray story, but also thinking about the kind of feminist work that Justice Ginsburg was doing in the 70s as the co-founder of the ACLU Women's Rights Project. We discovered that they had brought a case, for example, that made a very intersectional argument against the forcible sterilization of single mothers, primarily black women in North Carolina. A woman named Niall Ruth Cox walked into the ACLU office in New York with a crumpled up piece of paper, and she had been a teen mom, and her mother was told, if you don't agree to get your daughter sterilized, a hysterectomy of a teenager in the 70s, quite recent, then we'll take away your welfare payments. And this was an extremely widespread practice that didn't end until, I think it was 1978. And the Women's Rights Project under Justice Ginsburg's leadership brought a federal case arguing a violation of her equal protection on the particular grounds of race, gender, marital status, economic status. And I think, reading that complaint today, an incredibly tragic story, and now Ruth Cox is still alive, just thinking about how issues of reproductive rights and coercion play out so differently. So some women are being forcibly sterilized. Some women are being coerced to get an abortion. Other women are denied access to an abortion. All of these issues around reproductive rights play out differently depending on where you are in your life and who you are and what the state thinks you should do about your reproduction. So it was really wonderful for us to discover just how rich and complex Justice Ginsburg's feminist work had been.
You talked to a number of her clerks over the years for the book, and I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what it's like to clerk for her, or just more generally at the Supreme Court level.
So her clerks, I think, work harder than they've ever worked in their lives. One of them told me that he had twins, and he slept more when they were babies than he did when he clerked for Justice Ginsburg. She's not mean, but she's very demanding and has very high standards for her work product. Those are standards to which she holds herself and everybody in her chambers. So one time she returned a draft to one of her clerks with every single word in a paragraph crossed out and rewritten except for the word "the," which was circled. So I think at one time they gave her as a gift a menu that had been corrected as she corrected things. We actually have one of the things that we're most proud of that we have in the book and feel most honored to share with the world is Marty Ginsburg, her husband's letter to her from 10 days before he died. And it's in his own handwriting. And this was given to us by Justice Ginsburg right before the book went to press. And had we not had that letter in its original form, we wouldn't know that she had actually corrected him in the margins of this letter that he wrote us. It was a love letter that he wrote her as he was dying. He said, "I have loved you more than anyone in the world for 56 years. For some 56 years," and she wrote in the margin, nearly 60. Kind of crazy. She's an extraordinary woman. Very precise. But it's funny because there are two occasions, we talked to a lot of clerks, and there are two occasions in which Justice Ginsburg kind of chills out as a boss, or two types. And one is she's very invested in her clerks' romantic lives. And when she found out that one of her clerks was dating a clerk for retired Justice Harry Blackmun, she was like, "Oh, we have to have her over to tea." And so, if you saw the picture in the Times of her having Gloria Steinem over to tea, imagine two awkward young clerks who haven't been dating that long, basically being chaperoned by Justice Ginsburg.
Not intimidating at all.
Yeah, no, not awkward at all. But then she presided over their wedding, and she always says, she loves presiding over weddings, she always says, "by the power invested in me by the Constitution." And so this clerk, Paul Berman, told us, we always joke that if we got divorced, it would be unconstitutional.
Good.
And then my other favorite clerk story is when Justice Alito had just joined the court, and he's a big baseball fan, and his clerks had a fantasy baseball league team, and there was a leak with I'm about to show my hardcore sports ignorance, but to the best of my reporting, there was this leak. There were different teams from different justices, and this particular year, Justice Ginsburg's clerks soundly beat Justice Alito's clerks. And one of these clerks came to Justice Ginsburg and said, "Listen, we're doing this thing. We just won. I think you should send a memo to Justice Alito bragging about how we beat him." And it was his first year on the court. And she was like, "What is fantasy baseball? What is this?" And this clerk has drafted a memo that he wants Justice Ginsburg to sign. And so he slides it across the table. And he's like, "Take a look." And she just looks at it. She pulls out her red pen, starts making corrections. And in the end, it said something like, Dear Sam, I understand my clerks have soundly beat your clerks 10-1. We expect better even from the junior justice.
So it sounds like a very active and exciting place for sure.
It's challenging, but there are moments of levity.
Yes. So I want to ask many more questions, but I'm very cognizant of the time here, and I want to make sure that you all have a chance to ask some questions. So why don't we open it up for some conversation with everyone else? And offices that are watching us and not here live, you're welcome to ask questions as well. If anyone has a question, you're welcome to raise your hand.
I thought lawyers have lots of questions.
That's a good question, and you talk about it in the book, but Justice Ginsburg talks about how feminism and the fight for equality isn't just good for women, it's also really important for men. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that. I know that's a conversation that we have at Mediaite quite often, and I think it needs to be a bigger part of the conversation of women in the law and women in other professions as well.
Yeah, thank you for asking that, Julie. So when Justice Ginsburg was running the Women's Rights Project, there was some grumbling about the fact that many of her plaintiffs, in fact, by the time she was done with her litigation campaign, the majority of the people that she represented were men. And they said, it's not the Men's Rights Project, it's the Women's Rights Project. But Justice Ginsburg had a long game in mind and was very strategic about why she was doing this. And it wasn't just because she was arguing before 9 men, because often the men that she represented were subverting men's expectations, the expectations of how men were supposed to be. So one of her favorite cases is she represented a man named Stephen Weisenfeld, whose wife had died in childbirth, and who was denied a caregiver credit for his young son because only widows got it, not widowers, under the assumption that a man would never be the primary caregiver for his son. And during the oral argument for this case, the justices asked if there was a standing issue because they didn't believe that this man would have been the primary caretaker for his child. So often with these male plaintiffs, she wasn't giving the justices men that they could relate to. She was profoundly challenging their vision of what men were supposed to do and be. And I think she also realized that as long as we have a society in which men hold the power and control the resources, that you have to convince men that they have a stake in this too. You know, we have a story in the book where she was at a dinner party and somebody referred to, and she was a judge at that point on the DC Circuit, and somebody referred to her work in women's liberation. She interrupted that person and said, it's not women's liberation, it's men and women's liberation. And so it's not just that, you know, for women to advance, men need to participate in the conversation about gender equality. It's also that men are held back by sexism and by limited notions of what men are supposed to be. And I think when it comes to Justice Ginsburg's support for marriage equality and for LGBT equality writ large, it comes out of that same understanding that once you, for example, take gendered hierarchies out of marriage, once you say that men and women should be free to be human beings, free from gender stereotypes, you then lay the groundwork for gender roles to not be so rigid in the realm of sexuality. So that's very much an unfinished project, as I think everyone in this room knows, although I'm really happy to see some men.